Hello everybody, welcome to episode 149 of Show for You. Today I'll be going over the brand new Backrooms movie. Now, this is actually like fresh off the press. I believe the movie actually only came to theaters like 2 days ago at this point, at the time of recording, which probably be a day before it comes out. Or at least a day before my video comes out. And I went to go see movies today with my girlfriend, and it was a lot better than I was expecting. And I really ended up enjoying it. So let's try to get into the story. So our movie starts off with us seeing as a async, which is like the corporation that actually deals with the backgrounds, are like the ones who are searching it, scouting out, mapping it, and all that stuff. We see as an async worker is ultimately running through the backgrounds, and they've gone farther than they ever have before, and they got lost, but they found like this like surround sound system to speak through, and they're speaking through it, but ultimately they end up getting pursued by the entity and are killed, presumably. But then we get to see like the beginning of like our story. We see as we're introduced to Clark Calvin, who is a who is a like furniture salesman is the best way to go about it. But he has lost dreams of being an architect, but he is forced to work as a furniture salesman because his wife is going through law school and acquiring a degree. And we see that he has a lot of contempt about this because he feels as if he's underappreciated for the work he does when she has the easy life of being a student. And we actually see this in a therapy session, which is what we get at the relative beginning of the movie. And we see he is talking with this therapist who goes by the name of Mary Klein. There's actually only really like 5 characters in all this movie, so it's really easy to keep up with them. But yeah, so we see he's talking with Mary Klein. They end up doing a little bit of role playing about the night where Clark ended up getting kicked out of his house. And we see that Clark, in fact, came home drunk one night after having worked at the his furniture store for a long time, and he and his wife got into an argument where he belittled her for being a student and not doing anything around the house, and how everything that was essentially going wrong in his life was all her fault. Why he wasn't an architect was her fault. So he was just kind of blaming her for not living up to his dreams. But yeah, so we kind of see then as the next day, Clark is filming a video where, for actually a commercial where he's, because what his establishment's name is, it's, crap. Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire. Yeah, okay. Because he sells Ottomans, obviously, since it's a furniture store, but it's kind of a contrasting of themes because, I mean, Ottomans and pirates are not really fitting. But yeah, so we see this. He ends up filming a a commercial where he is having his assistant, one of his workers, who's by the name of Kat, and her boyfriend, whose name is Bobby, film him this commercial, and ultimately kind of goes awry on all that stuff. And we just kind of see as this plays out. We learn that Clark is in fact living in the store itself now because obviously his wife kicked him out, so he has nowhere else to go. And we see as he actually interacts with the electric maintenance man, or a dude with the electric company, and we see that his electricity is becoming quite finicky. Like, it's not working very well or anything. And like everything's flickering. He mentions about how the lights just randomly flick on at night. And they go down and look at the breaker box, and they see there's 2 oddly placed breaker switches. There are 2 red ones, and they're like diagonal, when all the other ones are obviously vertically and very uniform. And this obviously makes him concerned, and they like flick the switch. Gosh, goodness. But yeah, I flick the switch, see what it goes to, and ultimately they don't figure it out. So they kind of go about their thing. Ultimately, night comes, and we see as Calvin is, I'm just gonna call him Calvin because I mean he's called Clark throughout most of the movie, but his name's Calvin Clark. So I mean he's got really 2 first names, but yeah. So he sees Calvin. I'm going to refer to him as Clark. Because we see Clark, and he's sleeping, and he's drinking, obviously, because he has an alcohol problem. And he's watching a show, and then ultimately his TV goes off. And he goes back trying to fix it and all of that. Goes check the breaker. And then ultimately things start like flicking, and all the lights go weird and everything. And then he ends up coming back up and then kind of messing around with it a little bit more. Then we see another night. And this night, everything starts acting wonky again. So he goes into the breaker room. And he's unable to get anything fixed. All the lights end up going off and without him really doing much of anything. And he gets to like fiddling about in the room. And ultimately he ends up finding a place on the wall where he can just slip through. He falls through this wall. And it takes him to this odd area, the back rooms. And he sees a bunch of furniture and crap like that. And obviously he's startled. He doesn't know what's in here. This is random space in the basement of his establishment. So he's very concerned about it and all that. So we see as he's looking about, and ultimately he ends up just kind of searching everything, and he ends up like running around the place, making a circuit, and we actually see that he is almost pursued. He hears footsteps and stuff like that, and he is obviously frightened, so he ends up going in. He ends up taking a chair with him, coming out, and then coming back out. So we then see as 3 days pass, and he has been going in and out, mapping out this area slowly but slowly, and then we see as he actually goes to Mary with this. Like I said, once again, Mary Klein is his therapist, and she is a relative renowned therapist. She has a book and an audio program and all that, because this doesn't take place in the modern day. It's like, I'd say somewhere between the 70s and the 80s. And, like, I mean, I really don't know, though, but, like, I presume it was based on, like, the technology and the furniture and all that, so, yeah, but, like, what we see, like, the technology that Async has is far more advanced, but, yeah. So we see as he goes to her with this, and he's like, "I've found this place, and it is in there and all that." And she obviously is concerned by this. Also, I forgot to mention, Mary has an odd backstory that like really never ends up coming like to like much value throughout the movie. She is a woman who comes from a very troubled past. She became a psychologist, but her mother was mentally unwell. She kept all of their house like covered up and all of that, and she forbid Mary from going outside. And then ultimately, she was sent to a psych ward where presumably she eventually died. And Mary ultimately grew up to be a psychologist, presumably, or a psychologist, to presumably, I guess, fight what ruined her mother's life. But yeah, so we see this, and she ends up going, he ends up going to her, and he's like, "Yeah, I found this place." And she obviously is frightened by this sudden eccentric behavior, because beforehand, yeah, Clark was a troubled dude, but like he wasn't this troubled. And so she obviously is frightened, and ultimately he ends up leaving, and she like feels paranoid and like checks, make sure he's left and all that. And so ultimately, we see as he ends up going to Kat and Bobby's place, and he's like, "Yo, I need your help with something. I need you to come and film again, and I need you to get the camera." So ultimately, he ends up taking them out there, and they go back to Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire, go to the basement, and he leads them all in here, and he's got rope and stuff like that. And they're like, "Whoa, whoa, what are you doing in here?" And he's ultimately like, "No, don't worry about it. This is for in there." And so ultimately, he's like, "Okay, I'm going to the door." And they're obviously freaking out. They're like, "Yo, is this dude high?" And he's like, "No, I'm not inebriated in any way." Because, I mean, Mary had asked him if he was intoxicated before that. And he's like, "No, I haven't had a drink in 3 days." So we see as he ends up going through the door, and they're flabbergasted. So they're like, "Yo, what happened?" They're scared. And then we see as Bobby progresses along. I like Bobby. Bobby's kind of a goofy character. So we see as Bobby ends up going through as well. And Kat is freaking out after this. But Kat ends up coming in after them as well. So we see ultimately as Clark ends up leading them to a specific place that he's wanting to explore. It's like this big slanted area, and he needs a way to get back up. So he ultimately ends up sending Bobby, because it's very strategic, because Clark is the one who knows the setup of the back room so far. He has it all mapped out. He has the physical map himself, and he knows it. So ultimately, Kat and Clark end up staying up, and they tie a rope around Bobby and end up sending him down. So we see as Bobby goes down there, and it's into this very eerie area, the eeriest area we've seen throughout the back room so far. And we see as he is going about, and he sees that there's a bunch of like laundry piled up and all of that. And I forgot to mention, but when Clark first went in the back rooms, he found like this little like cardboard statue thing that was speaking in Hebrew. I don't know why it was in Hebrew. Like, I only knew it was Hebrew because I've been learning Hebrew recently, but it was speaking in Hebrew, which I never really saw any connection with it, even after having watched the movie. But I believe it's probably just a noisemaker, because I know why it's there now. But yeah, he ends up looking around, and he sees these laundry piles. And at first, when you see it, there's a head in one of the laundry piles. It's like, whoa, what is going on here? But it's in fact just one of those statues. And we see he continues to look around until ultimately he hears something. He comes running back up, and then he comes flying, and it pursues him. And we see as he's going back up until ultimately he gets up there. And obviously some of the string is still held back. And we see as he's trying to get all this stuff, he's shaking and all of that. And he gets to pulling, and then ultimately the thing starts pulling at him. And we see as he gets drugged back, and they're trying to get it off him and all that. But ultimately they are unsuccessful, and he gets ripped all the way down. And then they're trying to get back at to him, but they ultimately end up, because he had it tied to a bed. They had the like rope tied to a bed so they could like hoist him, but also have a like stable ground. And the bed ends up getting dragged and knocks Kat and Clark down into the area. And we see that there's a blood trail where Bobby got dragged by this entity or whatever it is. And then we see as Kat goes looking after him once more, and she ultimately ends up disappearing as well. So we see as Clark is left on his lonesome and with the camera. And he's going about, he's looking for things. and he ultimately tries to search for Kat, but he is hears the entity pursuing him, so he keeps running, running. He goes to like this area with like a pool and stuff like that. There's like a linoleum floor, and we see as he regresses until ultimately he runs up on this area where there is like a Christmas tree. It's like a glowing Christmas tree, a red room, and this is probably the scariest point in the movie, in my opinion. Like, it wasn't really a scary movie, but actually I don't know. But like seeing this part, and we see then as then suddenly he creeps around the Christmas tree, and a person just runs out of the dark, and they come chasing after him. He goes skedaddling. He runs away until ultimately he believes he's safe from him. And he goes to this room where there's a full-on wall, but he hears Kat's voice, and Kat's calling from him, and she says that there's apparently a glass like wall on her part, but Clark can't see her because it's not on his part. And so we see they're communicating. Clark ultimately ends up putting down the camera, walking to the wall, and trying to figure out stuff. And he's acting like if they're a knob or anything. But then we see as the camera starts moving, someone has picked up the camera and is progressing towards Clark. And here's where we go to Mary's point of view. So we see as Mary's just kind of going about her thing and living her days, going to like little parties with her friends and everything. And we then see as one day she gets a call, and it's Clark. And Clark has said that he has opened some sort of window and that he won't be coming back. So, this is really concerning. And we see as ultimately she ends up going and searching for Clark. So she heads to the Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire, and she's searching around and all of that, and then she sees that there's a bunch of bills under, so he hasn't been attentive, and so she goes looking for him, calling for him all around the store, nowhere to be seen, so she ends up going downstairs. And she looks around and everything, but she sees the blue outline of the door. So we see, ultimately, as she ends up going through the door, and she starts exploring the back rooms herself, until ultimately she ends up running on like this mural thing. And she looks at it, and she's just concerned by it and all that, because it looks like it was drawn by a child, but it shows some entity devouring, like the what do we know as async workers, and all of that. So she's really confused. And then we hear Clark's voice. We actually see a flicker of something out of the hallway, which is, I hate that type of horror because I've always been scared of like just something just beyond the eye. Like, ooh, it gives me the chills. But and we see this, and she's like, "Clark, is that you?" And it's like, yeah, but Clark doesn't come out at first, and it's speaking Clark's voice. And we look, and then ultimately Clark does end up pulling out. But I'm like, ooh, I don't trust this thing. But then ultimately she ends up talking with him, and he's like, they kind of explain. She's kind of trying to like de-escalate the situation. Then ultimately he ends up walking over to her, and then they hear something. And ultimately, what Clark ends up doing was he gets close enough to her, he gets her in a headlock, puts her out, and he's like, "This is for your best safety. This is for the best." And so he ends up making her go unconscious by putting her in a headlock, essentially choking her to submission. And then we see as she wakes up, and she is tied down in this like dining area. We see that Clark is here as well, and there's a dude in the chair beside her who appears to be very odd because he's like 6 eyes on his face. He's a relatively large dude, and I mean he looks normal besides that. And we see as her and Clark get to talking. Clark has obviously lost it. He's talking about how he's always went the path of least resistance, stuff like that, which Klein or Mary went over with him in the earlier parts of his therapy sessions, and kind of discussing that stuff. And then he ends up speaking with Mary once more, and kind of talking it through with her. And then ultimately we see as he is in fact going really crazy. There's a knife on the table, so obviously this is a concerning aspect since we have a crazy man, a knife, and a helpless woman. And ultimately he ends up kind of speaking about like the nature of this stuff. He ends up revealing like what he knows about the back rooms, which honestly isn't anything that's really too accurate so far, but he's like, it has to do, it's what you make it. It's essentially your mind. It's altered by your mind. And so we see then as he just kind of gets talking, and he mentions about how you can eat the people. He gets talking about the people. He's like, they are not actually here. They're not physically here. There's someone out there in the world that is this person, but they're not physically here. And that's why they can become all disordered and stuff like that, because they end up bringing them in without actually having them physically there. As they mentioned, as Clark mentioned when he first brought the back rooms to Mary, it's like describing a dog to someone and then asking them to draw it. That's why they're like this in here, and that's what the back rooms is like. So we see as they end up talking, and then ultimately he's like, you know what the best part about him is? You can eat them. So he ends up walking over and ripping a chunk out of this dude's stomach. Like, I was expecting something very gory, but it actually just looks like tofu and like syrup. He pulls it out, slaps a slab on the dude's plate, slaps a slab on Mary's plate, and slaps a slab on his own plate. He's like, yeah, it's actually really good. And then ultimately, obviously, none of them end up eating. And then we see as, afterwards, that Clark is like, you know what? I want to replay through that scene we did with me and my wife previously at a therapy session. So we see as ultimately he ends up telling, well, he actually goes over to talk with one of the statues. He's like, yeah, I'd run this with her before, and it never goes well. But then I've noticed this throughout when I was watching, but she seemed to be moving in the background. I was like, what's going on here? But then he's like, okay, you know what? It was a night and it was far darker than this. And he's like, you know what? Change the lights. And he claps and nothing happens. And then we see this little dude who's sitting in a wheelchair behind her ends up pulling the lamp. And it was kind of freaky because like these look like wax mannequins, but no, they're existent beings, but they're not like the physical forms that the actual humans they're based on. And so we see this, and then Clark's like, you know what, I want to get the physics in a little bit better. So he ends up walking to the woman in the corner that's like, been twitching, like Golden Freddy or something like that. Walks up, cuts her scalp off, puts it on, on Mary, and is like, okay, we're running this now. And so we see her scalped body is still over there. She's still standing now, obviously. And they start to play out the scene. And Clark starts to get a little bit more irate and all that. And then ultimately, Mary's had enough. And she ends up breaking the scene and telling Clark, yo, the problem is that you have never changed. You're unwilling to change. And you always blame something else for your problems. And Clark's like, what if I don't want to change? And she's like, you don't got to change, but you need to let me go so I can leave this area. You can stay here. He's like, I've found the place I've yearned for years and years. I want to be here. I'm actually comfortable here. So she's like, yeah, you can stay here and you cannot change, but you have to let me go. So we see is ultimately he walks over and starts cutting her bindings. And then we hear something is coming. And after this happens, we see as the woman who got scalped runs through the corner and starts banging and freaking out. Like, this was actually a really cool scene because she's just going crazy. And we see then as Clark recognizes this thing and he walks over to it. It is the entity. And we see as he walks over to it and he's talking with it. And we get our first look at the entity. It is the mascot of Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire. And it's a massive behemoth of essentially Clark in pirate regalia. And it's got very odd features. But he walks over to it. He's like, it's all good. Don't worry about it. She's our therapist. Well, she said we didn't have to change and all that. So it ends up picking him up and then biting ow, gosh, I hit myself too hard there. Biting a chunk out of his shoulder here. And then, obviously, Mary freaks out. She gets going, and we see the thing is still freaking out in the corner. And Mary ends up going and running. This thing obviously pursues her. And we get a pretty long chase sequence where we see as she's running around. At one point, she ends up going through this room with a bunch of couches, and she ends up not breaking her leg, but like twisting her leg weird. I thought when she like tripped, I thought her leg got stuck between two couches, like snapped, but no, she just got like a hobble. And then she started hobbling away and all of that until ultimately she ends up chasing running away from the entity until she gets to this place where there's a staircase. So she ends up going through it and closing the door behind the entity as it breaks through, and ultimately ends up coming through here. And she opens this door, and it leads to what appears to be, Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire, the building. And she believes she's got out. So she's going around everything, and she ultimately gets to the top, and then she gets to this exit door, and she's like, okay. She opens it, there's nothing, it's just wall. So she is in fact still in the Backrooms, and we see as the entity has come for her now and is searching for him. So we see she grabs a coat rack and is trying to defend herself, and she ultimately is able to break its peg leg, which causes it to crawl exclusively. But then she's walking around, and then she runs into one of those cardboard things that are speaking Hebrew, and these things were in fact put up by Async to attempt to capture anything that was within the Backrooms, and it starts spraying this gas, and this ultimately ends up affecting Mary, and she ends up falling out as the entity keeps crawling toward her. But she is able to actually crawl away and get away from it. And then she ultimately keeps running until she gets to this crevice, and it tries to reach her and all that. But before that, she's still crawling, and it ultimately gets up on top of her. But she reaches out and gets this piece of concrete from her old family house where her and the mother had put their hands in the concrete. Very cute little wholesome thing. It starts bashing it on its head until it breaks, and then she's able to get away, get to this crevice, and go through it, and it keeps reaching for like scratching her and all that, but she's able to ultimately escape. When she gets to the other side, she sees that there are Async characters. They spray her with the gas and she falls down and all that, but they ultimately end up carrying her to the Async lab area. And so she gets carried to this area, and ultimately we see as she's healed up. They take MRIs, x-rays of her and stuff like that. And then the next big thing we see is she is being interviewed by this individual. Now, I forgot to mention a very not really integral character until this point, but I'll kind of give his story. So, there's this one dude who, like, when Clark first went to the back rooms, he saw him on the cameras because there's cameras in the back room set up by Async, and he saw this dude on the cameras. He's like, "Yo, how did this dude get in here?" And so then one day we get a random clip of this family who's watching TV, and they get a clip on TV from Clark's store, and the dude who sees this is in fact the dude who had saw him in the back rooms originally. So he notices who this is and where this is. So we then get to the present point where I was talking about with Mary where we last left off, and this dude's name is Phil. Phil works for Async and reveals kind of the background of Async. He reveals how they started off with being an MRI company, but ultimately they discovered the back rooms and they've been exploring it. And he starts to ask questions, and he asks if, is this the person that you were in the back rooms with? And it has a picture of him with Clark with the entity like blacked out. And she's like, yeah, but she obviously is curious about this and keeps asking questions. And then he asks, is this the establishment of where you got into the back rooms? And she's like, yeah, I got into that from the bottom stairs. So then he is now willing to describe some of the back rooms because she keeps asking questions. It's going to be difficult to question. So he ends up describing that he, in fact, goes around the back rooms and slowly works on charting it out further and further each time to try and better understand it. And so we see how it continues to progress, and ultimately we learn that the construct of the backgrounds is based upon the memories of the people who are within it, which is very important. So we see then he continues to talk with Mary, and Mary's like, okay, where will I go? What will you do with me? And he's like, I'm not high enough clearance to tell you that. I don't get to decide that. And ultimately she kind of just ends up smiling, and we see as she drifts off, and then we get to see more areas of backrooms. We see that her old demolished house is in the backrooms now. We see as Captain Clark's Ottoman Empire is in the backrooms. We see also as a hollow of Mary is in the backrooms. We see as she has like 6 fingers and she's sitting there. So after that, that's when the movie ends. So this had me curious because, alright, so with this, we know that the people within the back rooms shape it with their memory. That's why the Ottoman store was in there. That's why Mary's old house was in there, because now it's being shaped from Mary's mind. That's why the entity looked like Clark, because it was being shaped from Clark's memory. So the people within it alter its construct based on the memories. And like I said, with that ending, we don't really know what happened to Mary, so it's kind of ambiguous. We don't know if she started to work with Async, if she got released, or if she got killed or something like that. But yeah, so it was just a really cool concept about how each time a person interacts with the entity, it will likely be a different thing depending on the group of people that they're with. Because obviously, since Clark was in there, the entity looked like Clark. But other things, like possibly if Clark had never been in there, Mary would have seen a different entity. So I wonder what that would have been. But yeah, so one thing that made me curious is the character of Mary's mom. Now she's in here a lot for us to know nothing about her. So I was possibly curious about if the house could have been in there because Mary's mom had some association with the back rooms. However, that would be unplausible because it was a demolished house, and she wouldn't have known what it was like because she was in the psych ward by then. Because it happens at the beginning of the movie where you see her Mary's childhood house get demolished. And yeah, I really liked that final inclusion of why the back rooms like it was, why the entity looked like it did, and just like kind of the reasoning behind it. And I really enjoyed it. Like I said, this movie, I was not expecting it to be good at all because it's a YouTuber movie. But YouTubers started to show their mettle. Because like we got Iron Lung with Markiplier, and now we got this with Kane. And it was great. Now, I gotta admit, it was a slow burn movie. The first 40 minutes, I was sitting there, I was like, daggone, I done wasted my money. Biggest waste of money ever. But after about 40 minutes, and after that exposition is done, it gets going. Like, after Clark goes into the back rooms for the second time with the, well, not the second time, but the second time on screen with the group, that's where stuff gets going, and it's really, really good after that. And I really love how they provided a lot of exposition at the end of the movie, even though, like, we've already done everything by then. It was really cool to see everything kind of connect together. I really enjoyed it. I know everyone won't enjoy it because it is very slow, but I deeply enjoyed it. Like, I love this movie, and I'm not really that big a fan of the Backrooms. I watched, like, a couple of film theory videos on it, and I watched, like, the first episode when it came out, but I was honestly happily pleased by it. I would give it, I'd say, a solid 6.5, 6 out of 10. Like, that's not to say it was, that's not to say it's like, it's not like Revenge of the Sith is my favorite movie of all time. It's no not Hacksaw Ridge. It's no Shawshank Redemption, but it's not awful. Like I enjoyed it. It is a good movie. I would highly recommend watching it at least to give it a try, because I believe everyone can find something to enjoy from it. I really enjoyed like the psychological aspect. I love to see the breakdown of Clark and what role it played. So I really just enjoyed like the psychology behind it and the world building at the end. So yeah, I would highly recommend going to see the movie, and it is really enjoyable. I would love to see more movies by Kane because I liked this concept. Because it kind of reminded me of a Tarantino movie in a way. Like you're getting a bunch of like information throughout it, and you're like, what the heck does this all do? But then it all kind of ties in at the end. You kind of understand it once you get to the conclusion. So yeah, that was all there really was to the Backrooms movie. I really enjoyed it, and like I said, highly would recommend. But that's all I really have for episode 149 of Shelf Review. So thank you very much for watching.